So my name is Matt Lowman. I have been sober for 5 years. My sobriety date is January 5th of 2017. I was introduced to the 12 steps 17 years ago. About 10 years later that I finally figured out how to properly work the steps and what information was in that book that I didn't realize for so long, because I had been going to so many meetings and so many sponsors that didn't even open the book. So I spent a decade not really truly going to meetings and thinking I was working a program, but I was not. Since then, since being introduced and starting to learn about the 12 steps and how to properly work them and all that stuff, I'm working at my third facility for alcohol and drug treatment, not to mention all the facilities that I've been to, seen addictionologists, psychiatrists, neurologists. So I have been in this field or, getting help for myself for the past, 17 years. So I've talked to everybody there is to talk to, and I've had a lot of great mentors. So, I'm as qualified as anybody to talk on the matter. So the first thing one needs to know about alcoholism and drug addiction is the breakdown of step one. For the longest time, I didn't understand how to properly break down step one. And the first piece of step one is we admitted we were powerless. And so stop there. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol. We admitted we were powerless over cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, whatever the case may be. What that implies, being powerless over alcohol, the book first says, or one of the first things it says about it is, we were drinking to overcome a craving beyond our mental control. Some people start off as moderate drinkers, and that's the category my mom falls into. She'll have a beer or two or a glass of wine, the occasional mixed drink. She doesn't need to drink, and even if she does drink, she doesn't drink much. And not only does she not drink much, but she doesn't even have to finish her drink necessarily. Then there's the hard drinker, that are people that like to party, or they do drink excessively at times. Although the times that they do drink excessively, it's usually intentionally said, hey, I'm going to go get drunk tonight. They intended on getting drunk. And then there's the real alcoholic. It can look different for a lot of people. There's two ways to identify a drug addict or alcoholic. And that first piece is the powerlessness piece. And what that means, I'm powerless over alcohol, my mom is not. I'm alcoholic and I'm a drug addict because I cannot control the amount of substances I use. Whether it be something as simple as marijuana, whether it be alcohol or harder drugs, for whatever reason, there are times when I start to use, and that's if I stopped, but I start to use and I cannot control the amount I consume. I may have intended on just, taking a couple pills, drinking a couple drinks, and just smoking a little bit, whatever, and then I used way more than I intended to. My mom is not powerless, and so that means she does not have trouble controlling the amount she takes, not even close, and furthermore, she doesn't even comprehend what that means to not be able to control the amount you consume. This is also referred to as the physical allergy being an abnormal reaction or a sensitivity. You can definitely say I'm sensitive to alcohol and drugs. It's a sensitivity that my mom doesn't have. She doesn't have that abnormal reaction. So by definition, it is an allergy, and that term still fits, although it can be misleading, because my allergy doesn't happen in such a fashion that I take one drink or put a little drugs in my body and immediately I just break out into the Incredible Hulk and just start consuming. It can happen very subtle, and in fact I've tried time and time again to test this alcoholism. In fact, the book says go to your closest bar room and try to control your drinking and try it over and over again to abruptly stop. So what that looked like for me is I would try to tell myself, like, okay, I can control it. And there was times where I could take a few pills or smoke a little bit or just have a few drinks. But if I tried to do that over and over again, there was just times that would happen where I would go into it with the intention of not wanting to do much and, black out, stay using for days, whatever the case may be, and I would lose control of the amount I could put in my body, which obviously does not go well as far as needing to show up to some occasion and not be extremely intoxicated, or to have to drive home, or being at a function like a wedding or any other type of party, and then being somebody who just gets obliterated and then makes a scene. Or even if you're not making a scene, everybody just can see that you're just consuming copious amounts of substance, and you get to the point where you're inebriated and you're not really present. What begins to happen, there is a brain change. And so it wasn't always like that. Although some people could be a moderate or hard drinker and become alcoholic, I was the real deal from birth. I don't ever remember using in a non-alcoholic way. Right when I started using, it was like I was using to get drunk. I was using to get really high. When I was younger, stop at certain points, but the intention was always to get intoxicated. Eventually, what happened was it gets worse and worse and worse for the alcoholic or drug addict. Was I would put, we'll say a gram of a substance in my body, and at first I got really high. Well, then I use that gram again, and I get a little less high, and so now I'm putting more of the substance into my body, while also gaining tolerance to the more and more that I'm putting in my body. So eventually what happens, mixing it with this powerlessness, is I'm continuing to try to reach a level of high or intoxication that is now somewhat inachievable. So now I'm really drinking and using to get somewhere that I have that memory of where I was once at, and so now I'm introducing more and more and more and more into my body. Body wants to maintain that homeostasis, so my body's adjusting. It's trying to regulate, go back to baseline. You could have your average person and how much they drink or use, and they're hitting a certain level, and now the alcoholic or the drug addict is requiring more and more and more and more and more. So it's crazy, because what would get an average person really messed up is now barely affecting the drug addict or alcoholic. I hate to say that anybody's a functioning drug addict or alcoholic, but like I said, as the body starts adapting and trying to maintain that homeostasis despite how much drugs and alcohol are going into the body, they are starting to operate. So I guess to a degree, you could say that they're functioning better than your average person would with that much drugs or alcohol in their system. However, there's that people who are like, oh, I drive better when I'm drunk. And it's like, yeah, that's just not the case. Basically now, if I do not put the drugs and alcohol into my body, like the brain and the body and it learns how to function with all those drugs and alcohol going into the system. So now when they're not put into the system, the body doesn't react well. There's withdrawal or discontinuation symptoms with all substances. The lethal ones being alcohol and benzodiazepines, two drugs that if I stop putting them in my system, I could die. Seizures and whatnot. So that's pretty intense. So, for your average person, and you're trying to tell them to stop drinking, if they're a bad enough alcoholic, putting enough alcohol or benzodiazepines in their system, abruptly stopping could kill them. So, talk about a level of powerlessness. My body begins to need those to function. similar to that in which, it does with other substances as well. Those two are just the only lethal ones. If you're a opiate user, heroin, pain pills, all that stuff, my body gets adapted to those and adjusts. And though it may not kill you, I would say most people going through an opiate withdrawal want to die. The body's freaking out. Whereas being under the influence of opiates, you are, constipated, you are nodding out, you're feeling very comfortable all over the body and just super relaxed and euphoric. Well, eventually I get back to where I'm putting that substance into my body and now I'm just feeling normal. So now take the substance out of my body if I'm an opiate addict, and now I have diarrhea, I can't sleep, my whole body feels uncomfortable, and instead of euphoria, I'm in dysphoria. Like, I'm just absolutely miserable. And so being in that state, to let a normal person know how that feels, it's like having the flu, a really, really bad flu. And so you can see why it's very, very, very hard to stop. The body has gotten attached to these chemicals. So the drugs and the alcohol have hijacked the brain. The brain thinks it needs those things to survive. As I've been using drugs and alcohol repeatedly over a period of time, the brain's like, hey man, food, even sex, take the back burner, and it's like, I need drugs. And so that leads us into the other part, because obviously for the physical allergy, it's very easy. If I'm allergic to peanuts, I don't eat peanuts. So if I'm allergic to alcohol and drugs, I cannot put them in my body, which, if I don't put them in my body, the powerlessness piece is kind of irrelevant. If I can keep it out of my body, it's like, okay, well then, being powerless over alcohol and drugs doesn't matter. So the fact that I can't control the amount I drink doesn't matter if I don't take the first drink. So powerlessness, it's very interesting. It's very meaningful in the reason that drug addicts and alcoholics need to be abstinent. However, it's irrelevant if I don't put it in my body. So that leads us to the second part of step one, and that's our lives had become unmanageable. So like I said, there's a quote in the book, when it makes the transition pretty much from the physical aspect to the mental aspect. The physical allergy is pointless and academic if we never take the first drink. It says, therefore, the main problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than in his body, or his or her mind rather than her body. So the problem's in my mind. I'm unmanageable. Alcoholic, drug addict unmanageability is not your typical unmanageability for your average person. Alcoholic and drug addict unmanageability is, so a lot of people would say your life's unmanageable if you're losing jobs and getting arrested, not managing your finances, all that stuff. Well, that's a byproduct that can be a result of alcoholic drug addict unmanageability, but it doesn't have to be, because there is people that are very wealthy and run businesses and have their life together, or appear to, but they're alcoholic or drug addict. And there's people that can't hold jobs and they get in trouble with the law and they're not drug addicts or alcoholics. So that's a terrible way to identify a drug addict or alcoholic. So the second piece, the unmanageability piece, is I cannot keep drugs and alcohol out of my body, which sounds insane. Wouldn't hold up in a court of law. In fact, most people aren't going to believe you. And the excuse would even annoy other drug addicts or alcoholics. But the unmanageability piece is the loss of power of choice. That means a drug addict or alcoholic who has reached that phase of their addiction, now, even if they can keep the drugs and alcohol out of their body to avoid the powerlessness, they cannot keep drugs and alcohol out of their body. So a better understanding of this would be the fact that, okay, so if we're thinking about the withdrawal, so like definitely the initial part of the removal of substances from the body. Like I said, with alcohol and benzos, it's fatal, and with other drugs, it's just unbearable. So if I can get past that part, which often, the book says a medical procedure or, checking yourself in somewhere can be medically necessary or just very advisable. But even after that, my ability to assert logic and reason, my prefrontal cortex, the executive functioning of my brain is how I make decisions and how I manage things. However, there's a fear system. And so when I don't put alcohol and drugs in my body goes into a state of shock and fear. It doesn't know what else to do other than to put the substance in its body. So this, fear system is like sounding an alarm, telling us that, hey, we're not okay. We need our stuff. We need that which makes us feel okay. When that happens, my ability to assert logic and reason actually deactivates. The lower part, the more primitive part of my brain is doing its job. It thinks it's doing what's necessary because I've conditioned my brain to think I need drugs and alcohol. So now it thinks I need drugs and alcohol. Not to mention, this is the way I've been dealing with fear. It's also been a coping mechanism and self-medicating. It doesn't intentionally start as self-medicating. I think for most people it starts by, I like to get drunk or high. However, what starts to happen is I start going through life and life difficulties and all these things, and so I'm like, oh, I'm having a hard time or I'm worried about something, so I'm just going to drink or get high. Over time, not only has my body adapted to it, but my mind has adapted to going to drugs and alcohol to solve problems or the appearance of solving a problem. And so when that happens, I cannot think clearly, and I've lost this ability to assert logic and reason. And that is the explanation of the loss of power of choice from a neuro perspective. So that gives it a little context rather than just saying to somebody, hey, you've lost the power of choice. Like, I'm just unable to not drink or do drugs. It sounds ludicrous. And when you put a little science behind it, it's like, oh, okay, that actually sounds like it's starting to make a little bit of sense. The one thing the book talks about is being restless, irritable, and discontented. An alcoholic or drug addict without alcohol and drugs is restless, irritable, and discontented. So that is what's going on. It's the fear. It's the body saying, hey, we want what we like. Whatever, this can be exacerbated by life circumstances that are overwhelming. So the more stressed out I am and the more in fear I am, the more my mind is telling me I need to use drugs and alcohol. Even if it's not conscious thought, it's subconscious thought. That is how I've conditioned my brain to respond to those times. So you take alcohol and drugs out of somebody's body and they start being run by this primitive part of the brain. Fear originates in the amygdala, and that amygdala sends information to the rest of the brain. In most cases, there's the ability for a brain to assert logic and reason in response to fear. However, in this case, the fear is so conditioned to certain habits and behaviors and responses that it automatically goes to those like clockwork without consulting the logical, reasonable part of the brain. And so that's why you'll see drug addicts and alcoholics do insane shit. The unmanageability is synonymous with the insanity. That's why when you get to a step like step 2 and it says came to believe in a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, it's implying we're insane. Well, the insanity is due to this unmanageability in the mind and the inability to assert logic and reason, because if something is unreasonable and illogical, it's insane. So that gives a little context to why the brain is being insane and doing insane stuff, or seemingly insane to other people, and often to the drug addict or alcoholic themselves. So the book says self-knowledge is not the answer. This is a point we wish to emphasize and re-emphasize. They even had to put re-emphasize. So that goes to say that this is not a matter of intelligence. Intelligence can sometimes be counterproductive because I can think that I've figured it out, that I can stop it. What's actually going on here is the reason self-knowledge doesn't matter is because this is occurring in an area of the brain that doesn't pertain to knowledge. It pertains to habits and biological functions and things that happen in the subconscious. That's why self-knowledge and how intelligent somebody is not necessarily a factor or a good thing. That's a problem because now the powerlessness piece comes back into play, and I put it in my body and I lose all control of my life again, and my brain gets hijacked by the drugs and alcohol once again, and they dominate my life and control everything that I do. So it's a vicious cycle. It just keeps going back and forth. When I can or able, usually requires help. When I can get it out of my body, I'm left dealing with the unmanageability. The unmanageability causes me to put drugs and alcohol back in my body, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, like I said, powerlessness is easily solvable by abstinence. Unmanageability is driven by fear in the brain that drives the unmanageability. How do I address this fear response? How do I address the fears underlying consciousness in my subconsciousness that are causing me to not have the ability to assert logic and reason? And so that is step one in a nutshell.